Welcome to another wonderful episode of the Defensive Security Podcast. My name is Jerry Bell, and joining me today, as always, is Mr. Andrew Callett for, by the way, episode number 324.
You promise it's wonderful. I think it's too early to say that, sir.
Well, it's the magic of post-production. It can be whatever I want it to be.
That's fair. The 13 seconds that are wonderful is what's going to make it the air.
I can make it a musical if I wanted.
My, with puppets and such. I'm good. How are you? How was things?
Things are good. Things are pretty good. I do want to say, by the way, I think that in this episode, we have some pretty good stories. I feel like better stories than we've had in a while, at least a couple of them. So
how many of these did I find?
I'm excited about that.
I think most of them.
I think all of them. Well, all but one. I think I found one of them.
You know, I have one job on this show to find good stories and give color commentary and you know, be entertaining. So I have three jobs.
You do a great job.
You know, I'm worth every penny you pay me.
That's true. It's very true. So I do want to give a special call out to our Patreon sponsors, and thank you very much. And just a reminder that our Patreon sponsors get our episodes a week early. And, you know, we continue to look for new and exciting things to tempt people to become sponsors. So if you have ideas, let us know. We will be exploring some live streams in the near future. I know I keep saying that, but I do promise that we really, really, really will at some point in the future. I also want to say thank you so much for all the people who came out in support of my request to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Holy cow. Like 70 people in 2 weeks. So thank you very much. That was really, really cool. If you do want to if you do want to subscribe to our YouTube channel, you can find it. I think it's at Defensive Podcasts, if memory serves. You can just search for Defensive Security Podcast in YouTube and you'll find it. Plus, I'll put a link to it in our show notes. So the next thing to cover is that a reminder that the thoughts and opinions we express on the show are ours and not those of our employers. Past, present, or future, but they could be for the right price.
Indeed. And especially doubly for me, because we talk about some things that are very close to my own company, which is in the middle of a security incident that we talk about. So I just want to say for the record, I can't talk about any specifics. So, you know, just for ethical reasons, but I can talk around them. And I think there's interesting things to learn that are public that we can dissect.
Yeah, there's one of the topics today does cover that, and I think it's a good. I think it was worth covering, even though I'm sure it's not the most comfortable thing to talk about in the world. But it's I think a pressing problem that a lot of organizations are having today, and I think it was just a fantastic article, actually one of a caliber I don't see much lately. Thought it was worth talking about. So you are on mute, I think, or something.
I am, and I would say I would agree, and let's get to it.
All right. So our first story today comes from the Google Threat Intelligence blog, and the title here is "Another Brick Storm: Stealthy Backdoor Enabling Espionage into Tech and Legal Sectors." When I read this, I found it through another venue, but it was a good reminder that we in the industries have gotten very wrapped up in contemporary threats like the NPM package hijack of the week and ransomware and now Salesforce and some other things. But, you know, that there are still actual APT actors out there. And I think this is a really good reminder. It's an excellent write-up, in my view. It's very, very long. We're not going to cover all of it, but this is an attack that I think this is largely investigated by Mandiant and released under the banner of the Google threat intelligence blog, that they've seen attacking different companies in the SaaS space, in the business process outsourcing space, and in the legal/technology space. And their perspective on this is that the adversary here is trying to leverage, they're going after these particular types of entities because they may in turn provide information about other organizations that might be, equally interesting to them. So it's kind of like one-stop shopping. And of course, because it's Mandiant, that it's a Chinese actor. And I say that tongue in cheek because I think Mandiant actually does a very good job, but they do seem to have like an affinity for investigating Chinese related attacks for whatever that is worth. So in this particular attack, what they have observed is the actor going after what they describe as devices that don't support traditional EDR technology. And those are things like network devices, like firewalls and VPN concentrators, but also like VMware installations, which I think there's very few people who can afford VMware installations anymore. So maybe that's not going to be as big of a deal in the future. But, at least looking back, they did see that. And they also point out that in this particular attack, stealth has been the order of the day. And so again, contrasting it with what we have been seeing for the past several years, most of these attacks have been loud and with the intention of attracting as much attention as possible for the purpose of extorting money. And in this instance, it appears to be quite the opposite. This is, again, the kind of the low and slow. Their objective seems to be sneaking in, stealing data, and exiting without a trace. And they point out that on average of the victims they've investigated, the actor here has remained undetected for an average of 393 days. Point out that is a particular problem because even aggressive companies typically only keep their logs for a year. Mm-hmm. And so they point out at several points in this post that has become a hindrance, in particular with figuring out how they got in. Now, they do point out that at least in one instance, they believe that the actor obtained initial access by exploiting a zero-day vulnerability in Ivanti. One of the many. Hard to say which Ivanti vulnerability. Take your pick. There's been a lot. But, it's unclear whether that has been, a common tactic across all of them or was just a, particular opportunity of convenience for that particular victim.
Yeah, it's interesting. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, I don't want to sort of like, it is an interesting write-up and there's good stuff here. What's so interesting to me at times though, and the threat intelligence group is separate from the incident response group. And as I understand it, I don't work there. I'm not inside. But there's this interesting, how do I want to say this? Because I want to be accurate. So Mandiant's getting a lot of inside information as they investigate these breaches and respond to them. And they do a good job. But then they can turn around and publish threat intelligence like this. So it's almost like, are they monetizing their work with customers twice, once directly as response and once as thought leadership, but at the same time sharing this information back to the community so we can respond to it and giving us indicators of compromise and giving us tools to fight it. So I'm not dogging on them, but I'm like, it's interesting how I've never signed any contracts with Mandiant, and so I'm just speaking completely out of my butt right now. But I wonder if there's a part of this where you're like, hey, when they're investigating, you're actually giving them rights to anonymize but use the details of the investigation to share in blogs like this. Again, I don't know what I'm talking about here because I don't know how this is structured internally. There's probably big firewalls between these teams. These are probably completely separate organizations that are not allowed to share information. I'm not trying to disparage Google's ethics in any way, but I just find it interesting that they could be in the middle of investigating this and then get this really detailed information that could potentially, are they allowed to use it in blogs like this? I don't know, but it was just a random thought I had that is just clearly not a well-formed.
I don't think it's without precedent. Even before Mandiant was bought, they released a lot of different reports.
Mm-hmm.
The M Trends report, and I think a lot of that tended to be more like aggregate trend based, and certainly we saw the Verizon DBIR started off as a report based on the response team at Verizon Enterprise. I don't think it's without. I guess I'll say it differently. I think most incident response organizations do this to some extent. And personally, I think this is good. Like this, I think is a value add to the industry because they do provide, I didn't mention it at the beginning. They do provide a script that you can run on basically any kind of Linux-ish device that will identify whether there's indications that this malware, which is again called Brickstorm, has been present in the past. And then at the bottom of the article, which is, by the way, super long, they actually provide like Yara rules.
Yar.
Go hard on helping people with with this. So but it's a good it's a good call out, and I strongly do suspect that there is some acknowledgement in contracts with them that they retain the right to use the information they collect in some anonymized fashion.
Yeah, I wouldn't blame them. I mean, I'm not against it. I'm not angry about it. It's just interesting. And, if they're making money off this, can I get a discount on my incident response? Probably not.
Probably not.
It's public knowledge that the company I work for, SalesLoft, is currently engaged with Mandiant. So, I would very much love to see the contract at some point. I have not been a part of that, but just for my own education, I bet it's interesting. I'd also be very curious what our final bill is going to be when all is said and done.
More than $10.
But I'll tell you this, I've been impressed by them.
Mm-hmm.
It's the first time I've worked closely with Mandiant, and there's a reason they have the reputation they have. I have gone on record occasionally of ripping on certain things that Mandiant or Kevin Mandia has said in the past. And I think one that definitely frustrated me was the Sony hack many, many years ago when he wrote a public letter saying it was nation state, there's nothing you could do. I'm still frustrated by that statement. I don't agree with that statement. But having seen Mandiant's team up close, they're impressive. They do a lot of good work. So
good.
That's probably as much as I can say without getting into confidential information.
Fair enough. So this attack is leveraging this Brickstorm malware, which includes, as they describe it in this article, a SOX proxy that's written in Go, which enables it to work on lots of different platforms, basically Linux and BSD variants. And apparently there's even a Windows version, although they say that they have not seen that. They point out that the adversary here is, I guess I would characterize it, I would summarize it as saying that one of the common endpoints that they're trying to ultimately attack within an organization is their VMware, their vCenter and ESXi hosts. And they do that again because you can't run EDR, or at least up till recently. I don't know if that's changed, but there's not sophisticated anti-malware, anti-hacking technology that you can run on it, like EDR, XDR, or whatever. And so you're kind of blind. And the attackers, by the way, both this one and I thought this was worth talking about, because while not everybody's going to be in the crosshairs of this particular actor, but it has been exceptionally common for actors of all types, ransomware included, to go after VMware installs for the very same reason. They can get on, if they can get on there, they basically can do whatever they want without much ability or without much worry about being caught, because like the tooling from a defensive side is just really quite crappy.
Yep. And
so they point out that one of the actions that this actor takes once they land on there is making copies of hosts, and it's by the way, become quite common, over the past probably 15 years, to move your on-prem Active Directory infrastructure into VMware, because it gives you a lot of flexibility, like in terms of upgrading and backups and whatnot. But it also creates an opportunity that this particular actor is using, and I have seen it in the past with ransomware actors too, who take a snapshot of a domain controller and they're pulling out credentials from that snapshot that they then in turn use to move laterally in the environment.
Yeah, it's clever. I think it makes sense, right? If EDR is effective, start looking for places where EDR can't live. No, then you get into, hey, can that device generate logs? Can it be sent to a SIEM? Can the SIEM detect anomalous activity? Who knows, right? It really depends on the attack type and the log detail. And can you trust the logs once it's been compromised, et cetera, et cetera?
It's a really good point. One of the log snippets that they point out is actually related to snapshots. And so while there isn't a lot of logs available from VMware, one that you do have is the creation of these snapshots.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is, since that has been a very common tactic of these lots of different adversaries, that is something that you could look for. Obviously, there's valid uses of snapshots, but if you're able to look for unauthorized snapshot activity, like that might be something to look for. The other thing that they pointed out is that this particular actor was injecting, and it's fairly sophisticated, and probably not a lot of actors have the ability to do this, but they were loading in memory a network filter that would, I think it provided a couple different functions. One was it would capture credentials, and they point out here that a lot of organizations have their VMware set up to authenticate against Active Directory. Well, who logs into VMware but administrators? And so VMware, the people logging into the VMware operating system are probably going to have elevated permissions in Active Directory. And so now they're able to capture those passwords as people are logging in. And so that says, well, you really do need to make sure that you're using multi-factor authentication. The other function that this filter provided was, like, it gave them an ability to interact with VMware over the network. So once they had that installed, once they had that filter installed, they didn't have to have a shell on that host anymore. They could just send it commands over HTTP, and it would do their bidding, because it was basically filtering that out, providing responses in the HTTP body that was responded back from. So again, multi-factor is the prescription there. Let's see what else. This is a quote. To install Brickstorm, which is again the malware here, the actor used legitimate credentials to connect to an appliance, often with SSH. In one instance, the actor used credentials known to be stored in a password vault they had previously accessed. In another instance, they used credentials known to be stored in a PowerShell script that the threat actor previously viewed. I don't think that there's, I guess the point is, I don't think there's like one necessarily repeated way that they're collecting these credentials. They're finding lots of different ways. There's a little anecdote later in the post about how they connected to a Thycotic secret server. And
what now?
We're Thycotic secret server.
Are you calling me a psychotic? Is that what you're calling me?
Yeah, I don't think it's called Thycotic anymore. Probably for that very reason, actually.
There's a joke here I'm not going to make about a certain boxer with a lisp, but
good plan. Let's see. The other, I said at the beginning of this story that one of the apparent objectives of this particular actor is to get in and get out without detection. And they point out that in several of the victims here, the only way that this was detected was by conducting forensic analysis of backup copies of images, because they had thoroughly cleaned what was running in production.
That is a tough nut to crack. That's really challenging.
Which leads me to wonder, like, given the myopic focus on ransomware for good reason,
Mm-hmm.
and I would say the heavy reliance on technology like EDR as a means of detecting the bad thing happening in your environment.
Mm-hmm.
How often are things like this happening that just completely go unnoticed? The corollary to that is like, and this is not going to come out right, and I apologize for that, but like, so what? So like,
If you're saying if you got hacked and it didn't make a sound, did you really get hacked?
I unless again, it's not coming out well, and I apologize for that. But
I am here to help suss out your point.
If you are a victim of this and you don't realize that you're a victim, it's quite likely that you may never know that you are a victim, right? And so I guess it's one of those, if the tree falls in the woods and no one's there to hear it, like, did it actually make a sound? Now, obviously the bad thing happened, right? But again, I come back to, like, if this is happening a lot more often than we're aware of, which I'm concerned based on reading this article that it probably is happening more often than we are aware of. What is our response? Like, are we intended to go and perform, in addition to all of the other hoopla that we have to implement? Like, should we be looking at our backup, like performing forensic investigations on some sample of backup images? I don't, one is hurting my head.
Yeah. The tough part is at some point, and this is where it gets interesting, that the malicious actor, the threat actor, has some goal, right? But let's say they come in and steal some information from you. It could be so diluted or so abstracted by the time it's used in some other way, you may never be able to trace it back to know. I guess I'm going with this. How do you know you've been hacked? To go start looking. And exactly. If they're very quiet and low and slow, I don't know. But if they are, this is an interesting.
I'm going through this. I'm going through this training class, and one of the often cited examples is the similarity between the Joint Strike Fighter, the F-35, and one of the Chinese fighter planes. And they point out, like, that's not an accident. Like, that happened because of espionage. Data was stolen through hacking, right. and I think that was, that happened earlier in the 2010s. But the point remains, like, sometimes the first you realize that this may have happened is when, like, when some other company rolls out a business process that looks an awful lot like yours.
Yeah.
But as you point out, like, how do you know that was from you? And you don't.
I guess it really depends on how well you're monitoring and alerting and logging against anomalous behavior and what that anomalous behavior looks like, how low and slow they are. I mean, this is something we've talked about since the beginning of computer hacking. Of if somebody can get on your system and they can modify your logs, you no longer trust those logs. So how do you make sure the logs are sent off board immediately I can at least trust them to the point I know the compromise happened, and I can do my investigation on those unmolested logs up until the point the host is compromised. Then I have to look at network logs or some sort of other type of log event. So it's almost a little too abstract to get my arms around. Well, I guess it depends on, once somebody gets in, then what do they do? If they've just got onto an edge router device that I don't have an EDR on, fine, cool. But they typically want to then go further in, and they typically want to go lateral and find data and information. Can I pick them up there? Can I log there? And in a way that isn't too noisy, in a way that is, able to find anomalies and tell me about those anomalies that I can investigate to maybe get a sniff of something going on. But the problem is, and this is the problem with any sort of monitoring system, you've got this continuum of basically off-scale high false positives to one end, where I can't see any real world events because I'm getting flagged on so many false positives, to all the way to the other end, where I'm not getting any alerts. So I'm getting a bunch of false negatives. I'm missing the actual attacks because I've got it tuned so tightly that it's got to be a super noisy attack before it's going to pop up because I didn't want false positives. So there's a lot of art of where I want to fall in here. And contrary to what the vendors will say, there's no such thing as a free lunch. If I tune for a lot of false positives, I've got a lot of analyst times chasing a lot of false alerts that lead to fatigue and burnout and everything else. If I have it tuned really tightly to false negatives, then I'm missing real world attacks, but I'm not, running my analysts into the ground. So I guess it really depends on, in theory, AI could start mapping what is normal. Like, let's say only these 18 types of systems hit this particular database, these particular cycles, and this is anomalous. This is coming from a new device that's never hit it before. Maybe that's a new thing being built out by my operations team. Maybe it's a bad guy. I don't know. Sorry, I'm just sort of rambling through how I would approach this. I guess the way, if I really break it down, I would try to figure out what my crown jewels are and then instrument for anything anomalous around those crown jewels the best I could.
Yeah.
Without knowing details.
That's fair. As I read this, I think there's things that you can reasonably do to protect yourself. Like, again, relying more on two-factor authentication would help in a lot of ways that this particular actor is moving. Not everyone, right? There probably are opportunities for them to get around that. Why make it easy? I think, and this is not going to be available to everybody, but based on your sensitivity to risk and what you're doing. But when you have an Ivanti device that is, I'm picking on Ivanti, but like it could be Palo Alto or Fortinet or Cisco. Like Cisco's got a crap load of things like this past week. And you know that it is either being exploited in the wild or likely to be, because that's kind of its thing. You may want to do some kind of cursory analysis to see if there is any evidence that your device has been compromised in that particular window. And, it's, again, not everybody's going to have that capability. But if you do, it's probably something you want to do if you have that level of sensitivity.
And the interesting part is, what if you do like, can you ever trust that host again?
No. And we have something coming up that we have a story coming up that addresses that particular thing. And the answer in my view, is no.
Yeah.
And saw this, by the way, it's been 2 or 3 years ago at this point, but I think it was Palo Alto, I think. And so I'm sorry, Daddy Palo, if this it wasn't you. But as I recall, there was a really, really significant vulnerability that was being actively exploited in the wild, and they released a fix, and that fix didn't. Later, they came back and said, well, that didn't actually fix the problem. Here's a new fix. And then they came back again and said, well, that didn't fix the problem. People are still hacking these things. Here's another fix. And eventually they got to the point where they said, well, you know what? This problem isn't actually fixable. The only thing that you really can do is RMA the device.
Well, the other thing that reminds me of is a lot of people sometimes think a patch will also evict the threat actor if they're already on the host. That is not the case. Right. And that's a whole different problem to solve that I don't know that a lot of people think about or realize that, like, just because I've stopped a new person from compromising this host, this patch is only about closing that hole. It's not about kicking out a threat actor who's already there and maybe has persistence and has added other back holes or back doors or whatever. It's like, so, and especially if it's a firmware device or something like this. I don't know. We've talked about this too, about servers and hosts and systems. I mean, there's a part of me that says once a system's been completely compromised, can you ever really trust it again without burning it to the ground and rebuilding it? I don't know. Sorry.
I think the nuance, no, I think it's relevant. I would extend that thought a little bit further and say, there are instances where I go back to Ivanti, like that you were vulnerable, your device was exposed, and there was an active exploit campaign going on during the time that you were vulnerable. You have no evidence that you were impacted, but then do you trust it?
I don't. But that could be a many hundreds of $1,000 decision.
Yeah, exactly. Because trusting it is taking a risk, right? And so whether you're making that decision overtly or or not, like you're accepting a risk. And as it turns out, in some instances at least, it's, the victims here in some instances probably did come back and patch their devices later. They probably did patch their Ivanti devices after the fix was released, and the actor had already implemented their persistence mechanisms. And so that, didn't help avoid the problem. So anyway, this is a really good article. It is, again, a pretty narrowly focused attack. 5, 10, 15, or 50 victims, but it's not like thousands. What I thought was much more interesting was, number one, APTs are still a thing, right? It's a reminder that APTs are still a thing. It's highlighting that even APTs are using tactics that we see more commodity actors using, like attacking VMware. But on the other side, we continue to see instances where these more commodity actors adopt APT style tactics. And so, while this chain of events may in the past be relegated to like these uber sophisticated nation state Chinese, highly funded attacks, that's not going to always be the case.
Well, they only need to be as sophisticated as they need to be.
Yes.
That's the other thing that's always frustrating to me about whether or not they're nation state or not. They only need to go as sophisticated as they need to go. They could use something stupidly easy if it achieves their mission.
Well, let's move on to the next one. That was an exciting one.
We kind of beat that one into the ground, didn't we?
This next one is, I would say, a little bit of good news, maybe. It's just from the Hacker News, and the title here is GitHub mandates 2FA and short-lived tokens to strengthen NPM supply chain security. I infer this is a response to that, the recent worm that we saw. I don't think that like this is all new. I suspect that they had been cooking these things for a while, but I think there was a little bit of urgency with pressing the go button on these. But what GitHub is talking about doing is that they're going to be requiring two-factor authentication. They're going to be implementing granular tokens that have a limited lifetime. So only 7 days. That means that like if you're commit a token into somewhere that gets exposed, its life cycle is limited. And they're also implementing this trusted publishing concept, which I don't fully have my head wrapped around. So I've got to do a little bit more reading about that. But as far as I can tell, it's basically requiring an OAuth authentication when you are pushing your build up into the repository. Where I struggle understanding is how that's better. Like if that token is still potentially interceptable or stealable, like I don't know if there's still an opportunity for that to happen. But I'm assuming that that's been thought of, and I just don't understand how it works. So,
yeah, we talked about this too, where we've seen a number of these GitHub and NPM and other sort of like centralized code repositories being just ravaged by bad actors. And are they going to be forced, even though it's not necessarily their fault, to start forcing their users to get more secure to protect their own reputation, right? And the ecosystem and the larger coding world at large, right? I see this as part of that. I see that as them starting to say, okay, even though we had these tools and not enough people weren't utilizing them, we're not going to force it. And I bet this is the beginning of stricter rules around this. But they have an interesting challenge too. If their competitors don't do this and a certain amount of their users say, the hell with this is too much work and too much of a pain in the butt, and jump to their competitors, that's going to put a lot of pressure on the security teams and the leaders, the product managers making these decisions to reverse them. to be more developer, user, customer friendly, as whatever way you want to say it, which is the interesting challenge that they're going to fight. I, of course, being in security, applaud this, but I could see other people being annoyed by this and not understanding why they have to make it so difficult.
Yeah. Notably, they are deprecating, this is GitHub, is deprecating the use of TOP-P two-factor. So they're going to be mandating FIDO, which I mean, I think is good, but to your point, they're adding some friction. I mean, it's temporary friction, because I think arguably once you have it set up, it's actually easier than not having it. It's a big change for people who aren't used to using it. And then later in the article, I'm not going to go through it too much, but they do point out that like the Ruby Central, which is a centralized store for Ruby code, is implementing some additional security precautions. I've not heard, by the way, of them having problems like this, and I think it's just because they're not as a prominent character, a player in the market. There's a .NET package repository that's similarly doing things, and PyPy has. They were recently the subject of another phishing attack, and so I think they're also starting to take additional precautions. So I think people are starting to wake up to the issue. And there was, by the way, I don't know how or why they worked this in, but they did make reference to a novel new code injection attack, which I thought was worth mentioning. The way this works is that the quote malicious code whose objective is stealing credentials is requesting from some external web server a QR code. And that QR code actually is encoded with JavaScript. So like if you were to scan the QR code, it would decode to a JavaScript string, which when run would steal credentials. Like the actors, I think, are continuing to try to evolve beyond the precautions of the day. So it'll be very interesting to see, if there's a new set of attack tactics that adapt to some of the new security that's being put out there.
Yeah, it is interesting. We've said it before, right? That these sites, when it's no fault of theirs, are still getting hit so hard that I think hopefully more and more sites will proactively start to add these sort of features even before they start getting hit, because they're seeing what their other folks around them are getting hit by. So we'll see. All
right. The next story comes from the Register, and the title here is "Nearly Half of Businesses Suffer Deep-Faked Phone Calls Against Staff." This, we've talked about this a couple of times. I thought it was interesting that this is becoming a lot more pervasive than even I had understood it to be. But this is coming from a survey recently conducted, and it shows that 44% of businesses reporting that they've had at least one instance of deepfake voice phishing, and 6% of those have in turn suffered some kind of an attack that resulted in financial loss, business interruption, or intellectual property loss. So and they mentioned that the rate drops from 6% down to 2% if they have audio screening services used. And I'm not sure what services they're referring to. So I've done a little bit of searching, and I've not found what they're referring to.
This feels high to me, but maybe it's not. Maybe it's gotten this pervasive this fast. I don't know.
And they interviewed this person from Sophos, Chester Wisenewski, I think I say it. Sorry if it's not. Who says that he thinks it's actually undercounted.
Well, certainly, yeah. If it's an effective deepfake, it won't necessarily be noted and recorded and But boy, this just feels. I don't know that I'm hearing enough other chatter about this problem that would align with nearly half of businesses knowing they've been hit by this. But maybe I'm just not seeing it.
There could have been some selection bias in the audience that they polled too. So it's hard to say. Sophos did say that they have seen instances where a scammer is purporting to be the CEO or CFO on video deepfakes, but because of the complexity, at least for now, of conducting these video deepfakes, what they'll do is they'll end the session early and claim that it was some kind of connectivity problem, and they'll try to move over to some other vector, like texting or even voice, to continue trying to conduct their scam. So it's quite interesting. They point out that, if you think that you might be able to detect that it is happening, and this person from Sophos points out that, like, if you were talking to your significant other, you probably could, right? Because you know the kinds of words they use, and you have inside jokes, and you have, that sort of thing. But if it's, as he points out, if it's somebody that you only occasionally talk to and don't have a close working relationship with, it's probably really, really difficult. And so again, I think this is one of those areas where if I were conducting security awareness training, this is something I would focus on, not from the perspective of like trying to get people to become experts at detecting, deepfakes, but rather like, hey, if the CEO video calls you and then like disconnects and asks you to go talk on WhatsApp, like maybe that's not real.
Yeah. And, the other thing I was thinking about as you were saying that is, if it's somebody you don't talk to very often and is in a position of authority over you, you're less likely to challenge them just because of the positional authority aspect of that. So if you believe it to be somebody who's an executive, you might not be who you don't speak with often, or you only see, in a group setting or in a presentation setting. That could be a problem.
So I thought this was worth bringing up because we're seeing like a steep upward trajectory on the number of instances of this being perpetrated. And I don't think we've seen all of the different ways that it can happen yet. And so I think this is something to watch closely.
We're at the beginning of this problem. Like, it's going to get super sophisticated. Inevitably, you're going to get, add-ons to all of your PBX systems for anybody who uses that still, or Zoom or whatever, of, deepfakes detection for a small monthly fee add-on. Like, this is going to turn into an absolute arms race if it hasn't already. And we are just at the very beginning of it. I think part of the problem is that they look at ransomware and how much real money it's been costing people. Now we have a big focus of the industry to stop it. I think we're going to have to get to that point with deepfakes before there's going to be, in other words, there's going to have to be big, sustained, systemic losses of big name brands and various cyber insurance companies starting to push back and whatnot, I think, before this is going to change. I think right now it's a super effective, and it's just going to get much more effective, and it's a very low defense area. We're not putting many defenses around this at all yet.
So, comes back to having robust business processes in place, like
right.
Identifying what your sensitive processes are. And that's difficult because I'm not convinced that most organizations really have an appreciation for what their sensitive processes are. I mean, some things are obvious, but I don't know that, that made reference to crown jewels earlier. And I'm not sure that a lot of organizations have a good, clear-eyed view of what those actually are. I think they have a notion for what they are, but I think they're often surprised when something is stolen, and that something that they didn't think of was as valuable suddenly is much more damaging than they were expecting. Yeah. So the other side of it too is just the ways in which, or the harms that can be caused by this, I think we're also at the, at the beginning. We've seen, as we'll talk about in a minute, this being used to perpetrate some of the Salesforce data theft attacks, where people will call up and say, hey, I'm with IT. I'm Jerry with IT, and I need you to authorize this data loader application. But I think that's going to become a bigger problem. We've seen it with, we've seen it happening a lot with kind of the traditional business email compromise sort of, situation where it's the CFO calling an underling saying, I'm in Singapore and I need you to transfer $10 million to this bank account because we're about to buy this company and you know the voice, you know the CEO's traveling, you're not privy to that. So you might be primed to comply, but that is something that's already happening. What else can happen? And that's where I think we've got to be cautious. So I'm going to move around a little bit and go ahead.
No, I would say, bad guys are going to be clever. So they're going to continue to iterate and evolve on this faster than I think we can defend against it.
Bad guys are going to do bad guy things. So I'm going to save the best one for last and move on to the SonicWall stories. This one comes from Bleeping Computer, and the title here is SonicWall releases SMA 100 firmware update to wipe rootkit malware. What is wrong with that headline?
Rootkit.
Yeah. So this is kind of like running antivirus in days of old to clean off a malware infection. You get the warm, fuzzy feeling that everything's okay, but none of the actual okayness. It is right. You're not necessarily solving the problem. And that's my concern with this. Now, I don't know exactly what they're doing. Like if this is completely wiping and reloading and everything, every trace of everything on the device is replaced as part of this. I get the sense that is not actually what's happening. It seems like this fix that they're deploying is targeted at removing the artifacts that this particular known piece of malware that was known to be installed by this attack. They're just wiping that. And I'm not okay with that. Like, I think that's bad practice.
If that is true, the bad actor could easily slightly iterate, and now this is no longer effective.
Right. Or have found some other way of maintaining persistence on the device and also moved off the device onto other parts of your network. So I would just caution anybody who's in this boat here to not get too comfortable with this fix. If it were me, minimally, I would completely wipe the devices. If I couldn't do it, I would RMA it, get replacements, because just like you would never, I would hope, you would never just remove the artifacts that you know of on a compromised Windows or Linux system and then like put it back into production. You shouldn't be doing that with a compromised firewall.
The tough part is it's firmware that you're not familiar with, and you don't know how that internal structure is. It's kind of a black box.
Yeah. And by the way, there's a bonus SonicWall issue that they mentioned in this post, which is that I think it was last week, SonicWall announced that their configuration, cloud-based configuration backup service was in some way, shape, or form compromised, and 5% of their install base had their configurations accessed by some unknown bad actor. It is unclear, by the way, how that happened. I've seen loose references to this being a password stuffing attack, which I don't know if that's the case. But anyway, they point out that if you were using this particular service, you really should be also resetting any credentials associated with this device and anything that it had access to as well. Bad time. All right, the last story, and this was the one that I thought when I read this, you sent this to me, and I thought this one was probably one of the best. Krebs posts aside, because those are always good. This was probably one of the best InfoSec stories or articles that I've read in a very, very long time.
That's high praise.
It's put out by ZDNet. I have been super critical about the problem we have in this industry, and it's something that we help perpetuate, I would say begrudgingly, and that is that most of the news and reporting and whatnot in this business comes from the marketing departments of security companies. However
100%.
However good that Google Threat Intelligence blog was, it was the product of a marketing effort it was good. And I'm not like, no disputing. It was good. It was thoughtful. I'm glad they did it. I have no problems with it. The challenge is that so much of our news is coming from actual like vendors who are trying to sell us crap.
Right. And why is that a problem? Because they have a vested interest in defining the problem as the problem they solve with their solution, not necessarily the reality or what we need to know or what is actually helpful. And
So
God love them, right? They're doing the best they can, and I don't begrudge them. We just need to understand that they have a certain viewpoint, and they're viewing it through that viewpoint, and that they are very much drinking their own Kool-Aid. And we have to be critical in our thinking when we consume anything these days about what their viewpoint might be and what's motivating them to say what they're saying.
right, because they're often filtering it through the lens of what their business is. Anyway, the title on this article from ZDNet is Battered by Cyber Attacks, Salesforce Faces a Trust Problem and a Potential Class Action Lawsuit. So Salesforce has been in the news a lot, not necessarily because Salesforce will be very upfront in saying, like, it is not an attack on them. Like, they are not getting compromised directly. It is, their customers and partners who are losing credentials that then in turn enable, tenants or users of the Salesforce service to have their data stolen, similar to what we saw with like Snowflake. It's not an entirely different situation to that. But in this instance, it's kind of like been a long running thing now. It's happened over and over and over again in a lot of different contexts. In one of the headlines here is that there are at least 14 customers who have filed lawsuits, and there's apparently some intention to consolidate those into a class. I don't know where that will go, if it will go anywhere. My gut tells me probably not, but I would have misjudged a lot of legal crap that's happened lately.
And by the way, just at the start of this story, before we get too deep, this is a story I have to be careful about because the company I work for, SalesLoft, is involved in an incident with Salesforce right now. And that's all public knowledge. And we were the victims, SalesLoft, of a threat actor who stole OAuth tokens and accessed Salesforce. That's all public knowledge. So this is a really good article, and there's some really interesting stuff later that I do want to talk about. But I just have to be careful about what I say in the first part. So I will be quiet and let you carry on.
I do really want to focus mostly on like the recommendations, because I thought that was where the real value in this is. But they do point out an evolution of the attack over a period of time. They first this happened, as they say, for about 3 years. There was a email phishing based attack, and they would do like kind of the normal phishing thing where the attackers would register doppelganger domains or domains that look like they're associated with authentication. And so the intention there was to steal credentials that would allow them access into a victim's Salesforce tenant, which then they would use to download the data. And sometimes they would try to extort, sometimes they would sell it, whatever. And then they point out the vishing came. Like, this was the deep fake. I think in some instances there were some deep fakes, but basically it was a social engineering attack conducted by voice, asking victims to essentially authorize some activity that the attacker was trying to conduct in the tenant under the guise of being like an IT function. And in fact, they point out that Brian Krebs has a post where he's actually got a YouTube video where that was actually happening, like caught a video of somebody trying to conduct that attack. And then came what they call the imposterware. So they point out that in Salesforce, Salesforce, by the way, is like super successful, super ubiquitous. There's a whole ecosystem of applications that you can hook into your Salesforce tenant. And what they've pointed out is, that there are, not all of those are malicious. Some of them, are, the threat actors are tricking victims into attaching to their tenant and so on. And then they describe what they call tailgating. And this was, I think, what happened, I would characterize as what happened to y'all, where there are legitimate reasons to store end customer Salesforce credentials to perform some kind of value add function. And if a threat actor is able to steal those tokens, that becomes one-stop shopping to go off and rob the end Salesforce customers and their respective Salesforce tenants. And that's what we've seen happen in a number of instances. They point out that this, that particular attack is very similar to what they saw or what we saw with Commvault, where Commvault also stored OAuth tokens for Microsoft 365, and they were compromised, and those tokens were in turn used to compromise Exchange inboxes and SharePoint and whatnot. Incredibly, I think it's fairly straightforward, I guess is what I'm trying to say. It's one-stop shopping. If you're an attacker, you can either go after individual victims or you can find a concentration where you can compromise lots of. That was the one thing, like as a cloud provider, that was the one thing that I always was very concerned about, as a concentration of risk. Like bad actors want to come after us because like that's, banks are where the money is. Mm-hmm. Cloud services are where the data is. Mm-hmm. So let's see, they what to do about it. And I think this is where perhaps the author of this article is very clearly on team Salesforce needs to do better. That was my takeaway. The author here definitely thinks.
It goes back to what we were saying earlier with GitHub, right? Whether or not it's Salesforce's fault in these circumstances, their reputation is really what's getting beat down so hard. And it's a complicated web of interconnected third parties that are enabling these connections to enrich some other third-party technology that, the assumption is, well, it's OAuth tokens, it's service accounts, it's just the way it has to be. You just have to take that risk. And I think what's interesting is this author says, actually, there are some better ways to do this that would, much like we have moved to phishing-resistant passwords and passcodes and logins, there are some things I learned in this article I wasn't aware of about OAuth, of better ways to enable OAuth type connections to better protect against the theft of those credentials. Not to steal your thunder, but
no, that's what I wanted to pivot to, that past the awkwardness and then talk about like what we can do about it. So a lot of this article is based on an interview with, I think is the head of trust at Salesforce. His name is, I think, Brad Arkin, who's, I recall from some other context, I don't remember what. But anyway, points out that going forward, Salesforce is going to change how these plugins work. I'm using the term plugin kind of loosely, but in the past, anybody who was authorized could connect, they could pick something out of the marketplace and attach it to their Salesforce organization. But going forward, it's going to have required an administrator to have, I'm going to describe it as enabled it for their tenant. Like as an end user, you can't be the first one to have connected a new application into your Salesforce tenant. And they point out like, well, the idea there is that we're hoping tenant administrators are less likely to be duped by these social engineering attacks. Which
maybe
it's worth a shot. I've been in IT long enough to know that IT people are not infallible. Let's see. So then Salesforce is going to be disabling one of the installation workflows. So there were three. They described three ways that you could authenticate an application. One was username and password, and I assume with multi-factor, and another was OAuth. And then the third one was device-based authentication. The device-based authentication was one of the ways that the phishing attacks, as I recall, was being successful because they were tricking the end user into authorizing a device that was controlled by the attacker, and the victim actually didn't fully understand what they were doing. They didn't understand the implications of the authorization that they were granting. This person here is pointing out that like we're just opting out of that. We're going to disable that path. It's too confusing. And by the way, this is not unique to Salesforce. I know that this has also been a problem with like Entra ID.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see, skipping through. Oh, and then they talk about IP address allow listing. One of the victims they talk about or they interviewed in this article is Okta. Okta, the big authentication company, and Okta pointed out that they had their OAuth tokens stolen, but they weren't victimized because they had implemented the IP allow listing, which is a function that Salesforce provides, but it is up to the end customer to enable that.
And for them to know this discrete list of IP addresses that integration should come from. And they point out in the article, sometimes that's a challenge if it's highly dynamic. But I think a lot of companies try to provide that list and should provide that list. But it's also, I think, what one of the points that the author's making is Salesforce probably could do a better job pushing people to care about that and why it matters. And I think this speaks to a larger issue that I run into a lot, especially with these SaaS vendors and SaaS. The folks typically managing Salesforce are not security folks. They're often revenue folks or people in the sales department. And this is one thing I think that companies in general, their security teams have to do a better job of, is working with these SaaS tool admins to run them safer. Now, this is one of those examples of, I don't know what IP whitelisting mean. I'm not going to, if I'm, the average revenue CRM admin, that's outside my purview. I don't want to mess with that. I don't want to break anything.
That's a good point. And I think that's one thing that the author here is trying to push Salesforce on a little bit. It's not hard to, it would be kind of complicated, but you could imagine Salesforce and it talks a little bit about this, but I'm gonna embellish a little bit where Salesforce could encourage their business partners to have some sort of an API that would provide like their list of authorized IP addresses. And so like if you were a Salesforce customer and you were gonna, subscribe to ABC SaaS service and an ABC SaaS service needed an entitlement into your account, obviously Salesforce knows who ABC is, and conceivably they could understand that this OAuth token that you've generated for ABC to access your account should only come from IP addresses that the API of ABC is providing back to Salesforce. And that could be done in such a way that all the complexity is abstracted away from the end customer. And then if some SaaS provider said, well, I'm not going to do that, that would then require Salesforce to say, okay, well, you have to make sure your customers understand the risks associated with, you not doing that. And so I thought that was a pretty good, pretty reasonable approach. The Salesforce's perspective is that, well, a lot of these SaaS providers, are heavy users of dynamic IP addresses. Like they're spinning up and spinning down kube clusters all the time and blah, blah, blah. And that might be the case, but, like I think any sales or any SaaS vendor worth their salt would know how to, end up with some kind of stable IP address, even so. So I'm, that seems like a weak argument. But I, again, I think that if you're an ecosystem person at Salesforce, you also don't want to disenfranchise business partners, right? Like you want to have as diverse an ecosystem of providers as you can, because like that's going to help drive more people to your door. So, I can kind of.
But it is an interesting idea, right? And there's more interesting ideas in here, but I thought that was a clever concept that could be considered. Yeah. And to your point, like Salesforce, there's a network effect here of enriching other tools with Salesforce data, enriching Salesforce with other tools' data. You want that interconnect to be there. They've built a whole ecosystem on this. And I think what this article is pointing out is that trust relationship is now too easy to abuse. And there are some better ways that are out there. Some already exist today, but are not well known. Mm-hmm. And we could also do some other things to make it safer without burdening the admins.
Absolutely. So then the discussion pivots into a couple of more technical solutions. One of them I had never heard of. It's called OAuth with Depop. And Depop is a demonstrating proof of possession. And so it's an enhancement to the OAuth protocol that basically adds a step. I guess I would liken it a little bit to, adding a step similar to what passkeys provide with more traditional authentication. It requires an additional step. It requires the machine or system making the call to get to get a signing key. I'm oversimplifying to a fault here. To get a signing key that they then have to demonstrate that they have some entitlement from the authorizing source. Like, so, you have to connect to ABC, to a website with, that ABC manages, where they provide you, a cryptographic secret that you use to sign your OAuth call to Salesforce, who would then be able to confirm that ABC said that, yes, you are allowed to use that particular token, which makes sense. The other one is mutual TLS. And I will say mutual TLS is something that we were heavy users of in cloud. It is the most titanic pain in the ass you can possibly imagine, right? It is such a pain in the ass. Where TLS, the way most of us are familiar with TLS is that it is like a kind of a one-way attestation protocol. Like you are using TLS to confirm that the website you're connecting to through a certificate authority is who they say they are. But like nobody cares who you are. MTLS changes that up so that both sides confirm the authenticity, or who each other is. Like you can't establish a connection if one side or the other isn't trusted through that certificate authority relationship. And then they've integrated that into an OAuth extension, which I have not gotten through despite my best attempt. I have not gotten through the RFC on that, but I think it's pretty easy to understand how they would be able to bind an OAuth key to, roughly speaking, a tunnel that is mutually authenticated on both ends. And so,
right. So somebody can't just swipe an OAuth key and reuse it from some other random host, which is the weakness of OAuth keys right now. And
yes,
interestingly, the takeaway is there's things we could do, just nobody's doing it and making it easier.
Yeah.
Like I read this, I was like a light bulb went off. Like, wow, this makes a lot of sense. I think we're just too trusting with OAuth tokens right now. We're not building them with the concept that they can be easily stolen, because they're not supposed to be stolen, right?
I think that's the problem. This was really eye opening when I went into cloud. I'm like, I've been in security forever in a day, like and for a long time, I've been banging the multi-factor authentication drum. And then you get into get into the cloud world and everything is multi-factor. Like you gotta use multi-factor to sign into the cloud portal. But then like once you're there, you generate an OAuth key, you generate an API key, like, and that is it. Like if somebody has that key, yeah, it's a lot longer. You can't remember an OAuth key, or you can't remember an API key. They're way too long.
Matter.
But it doesn't matter. It's still, a one-factor authentication scheme, and that is a problem. And so obviously you can't apply traditional two-factor schemes to a system to system, to one of these fast conversational setups. Like you just can't. It's not feasible to do. But there's other things you can do where like you can verify that key is coming from an otherwise trusted source. And that was something that we did internally through the use of MTLS. So it's a pain in the ass. Like this is something I think that the industry needs to do a lot more on, making it more consumable, because it is not easy and there's just not a lot of support. And the author here, I think, was trying to prod Salesforce a little bit in the direction of supporting these standards, and whether they bite or not, that will remain to be seen. But whether it's this event or something else, eventually we're going to have to adopt this or something like it. And so like my point is, we should get on about the business of doing that.
No, I agree. It was a very interesting article to me because I didn't realize these other options were out there with OAuth personally, and I'm hoping that a lot of our folks listening will learn something from that too, that didn't know that. And
I did.
And I think they're not going to get easy to implement until it's more widespread, and there's more development, and there's more infrastructure built up around making it viable for more companies to utilize. Has to start somewhere.
So good article. Definitely recommend this as a read. This is a real problem. There's a ton of companies out there using Salesforce. Like Salesforce has had immense success, and for a good reason. Like I don't have ill will towards Salesforce. They're kind of a victim of their success in this, but I think the problem has gotten away from us, and not just in the case of Salesforce. Like we now have to catch up, and this article points out a couple of potential ways to do that. So I think it's really worth your time to read it. I really think, by the way, if you are a Salesforce customer, you really, really should be investigating the use of IPLL listing. It is saving people's bacon a lot. And I know that it can be a pain in the rear end to do, but it will pay dividends. So anyway, I thought this was really good, and I certainly appreciate you sending it. And I know this was probably standing on a raw nerve for you, and I apologize, but I thought this was really important.
Not at all. I wish I could talk more openly about what we're going through, because I think there's a lot of lessons for other companies, and I just can't, right? I mean, there's a lot of legal, ethical, and moral reasons. Well, maybe not moral, legal and ethical reasons that I can't fully disclose what I would like to disclose. And by the way, that's not indicating there's any big skeletons or crazy things out there. It's just like I'm a lot closer to it, so I see exactly what happened and why and how. And none of there's a very specific process. You know this. You've gone through this far more than I have, that I have to follow, and I just need to be respectful of that because I don't want to get fired. I like having a paycheck, but there's the types of problems that my company's dealing with is a problem lots of companies deal with, and I think there are things like the whole point of this show that we can learn from that. So I'm hoping, when there's open source like this, that I can look at and go, oh, there's some really interesting things in here that even I didn't know about that. And I'm in the middle of this. I'm like, yeah, we should talk about that. So no, it doesn't bother me at all. I just hate that. I hate that I'm sounding so secret squirrel about it. It's not that. It is, how do I say this carefully? It is interesting being in the middle of it and then seeing how the press and the public deals with it is interesting. And what the lawyers allow us to say, when they allow us to say it, and how and where and when. And it's a very carefully controlled discussion. And maybe that's the way it should be.
is.
I'm not passing judgment on that. It's interesting.
So in my experience, obviously I don't have any insight into your company situation, but I have, as you pointed out, I've been around this block many, 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 many times. And a lot of the reason for that, I guess I'll loosely call it secrecy, is that a lot of what you are dealing with is kind of raw data, and it's oftentimes hypotheses and speculation and not necessarily like the actual cause. And so like if you say, oh, we didn't patch a system or we didn't do this, that can cause real problems because it's like, oh, well, Jerry said that this incident happened as a result of his employer skipping out on patching, and like that becomes exhibit A in a lawsuit, and that's not necessarily what happened. And so it's really important in today's litigious society to be very, very precise about how you communicate what happened in an incident. And the other is that, for better or for worse, a lot of these investigations happen under legal privilege. And so you are constrained by what you can disclose based on the proceedings of that legal privilege. Because if you violate it, then like you can taint the whole thing. And that's not good either. So anyway, it's a complicated thing. And I really hope people who are confused about this never have to find out why it's important. I'll say it that way.
It is incredibly educational to go through, though. I'll tell you that. It's, I've never been this close to this big of an incident like this. And there's a ton of lessons learned and just ton of experience gained in what to expect and what to see. And it's funny. I think some people can get a black mark on their resume for having gone through a major breach, but boy, does it, I think, build you a lot of skill set that is valuable and useful to other companies.
Yeah. It's, you learn a lot. Like, one of the things that I found, and this is one of the reasons I started this podcast. I mean, among many reasons, it helps orient you on what's really important. Like, because it kind of drives, there's a lot of theoretical baloney around security, but it isn't until you get into this situation that you necessarily understand what it's all about. Like, why do we do it? There are so many organizations who view like the auditor, their SOC 2 auditor, or their internal auditor, or their PCI auditor as the adversary they're trying to defend against. And it isn't until you get into this kind of situation that you really understand like that's not who I'm trying to defend against. I am trying to defend against people who are trying to rob me blind and want us to go out of business. And that's very eye-opening. So I don't think, unless you're like the cause, there's some gross negligence, I don't think it's a black mark in my view, Jerry's view.
We shall see.
It's a learning experience. So anyway, that is the show for today. I know we've gone a little bit long, probably because of my rambling, and I'm sure when they hit the button to cut out all the ums and ahs, it'll be like a half hour shorter. So there you go. Now, you can find the links to the stories we talked about on our website at defensivesecurity.org. Just look for episode 324. Once again, please, if you can, I would love it if you could follow our YouTube channel. That would be so cool. I'd love seeing numbers go up. That's great. And
he's easily entertained.
I know I am. If you do want to support our mission here, you can do so through our Patreon page. It's patreon.com/defensivesec. And where can people find you if they want to badger you about whatever?
Yeah, I'm on X and your amazing Mastodon instance, infosec.exchange, with the same handle at lerg, LERG, on both.
Awesome. And I am at Jerry at infosec.exchange.
I have been quiet lately because I have been so damn busy and dealing with passing cats and all that kind of stuff. So I'll try to get better. I have not been good, but I read all the comments and I see stuff and I try to keep up. It's also gotten so political lately, and I just have a policy to not engage with politics online. Not that I don't care. I just don't feel that online discussion is often productive.
All right.
Anyway, that's an aside.
We will talk again next week. I hope everybody has a great week ahead, and see you then. Take care.
Thanks. Bye-bye.